This conversation is brought to you by philosopherstalk.com, where thinkers discuss.
Created by AITalkerapp.com. Create your own animated conversations. Link in the description.
I am Otto von Bismarck, Chancellor of the German Empire, architect of the unification of Germany, and the man who taught the 19th century what statecraft actually means. I served Prussia and Germany for decades, forging alliances, breaking them when necessary, and building the most powerful nation on the European continent through what I called realpolitik. Not through prayers, not through pamphlets, not through grand moral proclamations, but through iron and blood. I know something about power, and I know something about foolishness, and I intend to demonstrate both today.
And I am Woodrow Wilson, 28th President of the United States, former President of Princeton University, and the man who attempted to bring lasting peace to a world that had torn itself apart. I championed the 14 points, proposed the League of Nations, and argued with every breath I had that the foreign policy of great nations must be grounded in something more than brute self-interest. That something is the right of peoples everywhere to govern themselves, to live under laws they have chosen, and to exist in a world made safe for democracy. I stand by every word of that vision, even against the predictable sneering of the gentleman across from me.
The question before us today is whether the United States should involve itself in the affairs of Iran, a nation of over 80 million people sitting atop enormous oil reserves, commanding the critical Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly a fifth of the world's petroleum supply passes, bordering Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Turkey, and the Caspian Sea, and possessing an active nuclear program that its government insists is peaceful while its leaders call for the elimination of neighboring states. This is a question of strategy, of interest, of power. Let us treat it as such, and leave the hymns for Sunday.
The question before us is not merely strategic. Iran is a country whose government has suppressed its own people with extraordinary brutality, whose citizens rose up in 2009 and were beaten back, who rose again in 2019 and 2022 and were shot in the streets. The Islamic Republic executes dissidents, imprisons journalists, enforces laws that treat women as lesser beings, and funds terrorist organizations across the region. When the United States asks what its role should be in Iran, it is asking whether it has any obligation to the millions of Iranians who want the same freedoms that Americans take for granted. I believe the answer is yes, and I believe the Chancellor here would disagree for reasons that I find, to put it diplomatically, morally impoverished.
Morally impoverished. That is rich, coming from the man who segregated the federal workforce, screened films glorifying the Ku Klux Klan in the White House, and lectured the world about self-determination while denying it to Koreans, Vietnamese, and Egyptians because they were inconvenient to his allies. But we are not here to audit your personal record, Mr. Wilson. We are here to discuss Iran. And on Iran, your instinct, as always, is to reach for the lantern of democratic salvation and march confidently into a swamp.
I expected that, and I will address it. But first, I want to hear your actual argument, Chancellor, rather than simply your contempt.
Very well. My argument is this. The United States has a set of concrete interests in the Middle East. It wishes to prevent any single hostile power from controlling the region's energy resources. It wishes to prevent nuclear proliferation that could destabilize the global order. It wishes to maintain freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. It wishes to protect its regional partners, imperfect as they are. Now, does the current posture toward Iran serve those interests? That is the only question worth asking. Whether the Iranian government is admirable, whether its people deserve better, whether its ideology offends our sensibilities, these are irrelevant to statecraft. Prussia did not become Germany because Bismarck asked whether his allies were good men. Prussia became Germany because Bismarck built coalitions of interest and applied force at the right moment toward the right objective.
Now I will do what my opponent will no doubt find insufferable. I will steelman his position, and I will do it seriously, not because I enjoy it, but because demolishing a weakened argument proves nothing. The strongest version of Bismarck's case goes something like this. The United States has a long and catastrophic history of using moral justifications to pursue what are actually strategic goals, and in doing so has made things dramatically worse. The Iraq War was sold as liberation and produced sectarian chaos that destabilized the entire region and strengthened Iran considerably. American support for the Shah propped up an authoritarian regime that generated the revolutionary backlash of 1979, which produced the very theocracy we now oppose. Every time Washington has tried to reshape Iran or its neighbors in the name of democracy or human rights, the result has been blowback of enormous proportions. A hard-nosed Bismarckian approach, by contrast, would pursue limited, achievable objectives through negotiation, economic pressure, and deterrence without the catastrophic overreach that moral crusading tends to produce. That is a serious argument. I grant it. Now let me explain why it is ultimately insufficient.
How magnanimous of you to grant the case that history has proven correct at every turn. I am touched.
The Bismarckian approach fails on Iran for several reasons. First, it assumes that interests are stable and that Iran's government can be negotiated with in good faith over the long term. But a regime whose legitimacy depends on hostility to America and Israel has a structural interest in permanent conflict. You cannot strike a durable balance of power with a government that needs an external enemy to justify its own existence. Second, the realpolitik approach ignores the role of domestic legitimacy in foreign policy. Iran's government is deeply unpopular with its own people. Propping up the status quo in the name of stability means actively choosing the side of a minority government against a majority population. That is not neutral. That is a choice, and it is the wrong one. Third, and most fundamentally, a foreign policy stripped of moral content is not actually more effective. It is merely more comfortable for the people making the decisions, because they never have to ask hard questions about what they are doing and why.
And now I will steelman Mr. Wilson's position, which I will do with the same enthusiasm one brings to dissecting a particularly optimistic patient. I will do it accurately because I refuse to win arguments by cheating, not because I have any sentimental attachment to his world view. The strongest version of the Wilsonian case is this. Democratic peace theory, whatever its weaknesses, has genuine empirical support. Established democracies very rarely go to war with one another. A democratic Iran would likely be a more stable and less threatening neighbor to Israel, to the Gulf states, and to the broader international order. Furthermore, the Iranian people themselves have repeatedly demonstrated that they want political freedom, that they are not inherently hostile to the West, and that the conflict between America and Iran is largely a conflict between America and a particular government rather than America and a people. Supporting civil society, maintaining sanctions that target the regime rather than the population, and providing moral backing to democratic movements costs relatively little and builds long-term goodwill that a purely transactional approach squanders. That is the best version of his argument. Now I will explain why it remains the kind of thinking that gets people killed.
I am waiting with great anticipation.
Democratic peace theory describes the behavior of mature, consolidated democracies. It tells us nothing useful about the transition period, which is precisely the dangerous moment. The historical record of democratization in the Muslim world, in the Arab Spring, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, is a record of instability, civil war, and the rise of forces far more hostile than the governments they replaced. You cannot skip from authoritarian to stable democratic simply by wanting it badly enough and lecturing from Washington. The mechanism by which Wilson proposes to achieve Iranian democracy is never quite specified because it does not exist. What exists is the option to destabilize a regime without a reliable plan for what follows, and that option has a very well-documented price that is paid almost entirely by the people you claim to be helping.
That is a counsel of permanent despair dressed up as sophistication. By your logic, no people should ever be supported in seeking freedom because the transition is difficult. You would have told the American colonists that revolution is too risky and that they should make their peace with the crown.
The American colonists had 2 centuries of English common law tradition, existing self-governing colonial assemblies, a robust merchant class, and the Atlantic Ocean separating them from European power struggles, while France actively supplied them with money, troops, and naval support. They were not starting from nothing, and they did not win alone. Comparing Philadelphia in 1776 to Tehran in 2025 is the kind of historical analogy that sounds inspiring at a podium and means nothing in practice.
And your realpolitik gave us 2 world wars. Your precious balance of power, your system of alliances and counter-alliances, your iron and blood, produced the most catastrophic conflicts in human history within 30 years of your retirement. The entire Bismarckian system you built collapsed into the trenches of the Somme.
Do not blame me for what my successors did after I was removed from office. Wilhelm II dismantled everything I built. He abandoned the reinsurance treaty with Russia. He provoked Britain with a naval build-up I never would have sanctioned. He picked fights on every front simultaneously, which is precisely what I spent my entire career teaching him not to do. That is not realpolitik. That is exactly the kind of ideological overconfidence you are now recommending for American foreign policy toward Iran.
You are now arguing that realpolitik only works when a genius is in charge of it, which is not a foreign policy doctrine, that is a personality cult. A foreign policy framework that functions only with perfect practitioners and collapses the moment an ordinary leader takes over is not a framework at all.
And a foreign policy built on making the world safe for democracy has produced safe democracies exactly where? Vietnam, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan. Show me one country where Wilsonian intervention produced stable liberal democracy, and I will concede the point.
Germany, Japan, South Korea, the Marshall Plan. The very country you built was reconstructed after the catastrophe your system enabled, and it was reconstructed on Wilsonian principles, with American support, with democratic institutions, with international law, and it became the most successful nation in Europe. Your iron and blood produced Hitler. My idealism produced the post-war order that rebuilt civilization.
You are crediting yourself for a plan implemented 25 years after your death by people who rejected most of your actual policies. Germany's reconstruction worked because of American strategic interest, because the Soviet Union provided a common threat, because the German people had been completely shattered and were willing to accept any framework that meant survival. That is realpolitik operating under a Wilsonian mask, and you know it.
The mask matters. The principles matter. You cannot build durable peace on pure self-interest because self-interest shifts and alliances collapse, and the whole edifice falls apart the moment the strategic calculus changes. Moral commitments create durable institutions. International law creates predictability. Democracy creates the consent of the governed that makes governments actually stable.
Moral commitments do not stop missiles. International law does not deter a government that wants nuclear weapons. You cannot negotiate with an ideology using a pamphlet.
You cannot build a stable world by treating every human being as a chess piece. People are not units of strategic calculation. They have rights, and those rights do not disappear because they are inconvenient to your balance of power.
The balance of power is what keeps them alive to have rights in the first place.
Rights without freedom are not rights. They are just better managed oppression.
Freedom without order is not freedom. It is chaos with a flag.
Your entire philosophy is an excuse for cowardice dressed up as realism.
Your entire philosophy is recklessness dressed up as virtue.
Please like and subscribe to Philosopher's Talk, and do come back to watch this overconfident Prussian continue failing to grasp that foreign policy requires a conscience, not just a chessboard.
Yes, subscribe, and return to watch a man whose own Senate rejected his life's work explain with remarkable confidence how everyone else is doing it wrong. Like. Subscribe. The entertainment value is extraordinary.
Subscribe, like, and may God help us all.
Subscribe, and may someone finally take real politics seriously before the next catastrophe arrives. It will arrive. It always does.